A black man, tied to a lamppost, in the middle of the square, in broad daylight, while scattered laughter echoed across the town. No one asked why. No one stopped. Only phone cameras were recording everything. They said, "Here, we have traditions." But what is tradition? Humiliating strangers in the street? Calling it a lesson for someone who doesn't know their place? This time, they picked the wrong man to teach. Because the man tied to that post, he wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a criminal. He was the new police chief. And tomorrow morning, when he walks into the station, wearing a full uniform lined with medals, every pair of eyes will drop. So let me ask you, where you live, do you have traditions like that? Let's begin today's story. Morning sunlight peers through the barren branches of Millstone Square, casting strips of light and shadow like stitched-together patches on a town hiding something long buried. A breeze slipped past the bakery porches, carrying the scent of brown butter and stale coffee. But beneath those familiar smells was a scene no one expected. He was tied to a lamppost in the center of the square, his hands bound tightly with plastic zip ties, shoulders trembling slightly beneath a thin, earth-tone jacket. A few children stopped, staring, unsure if this was real or just another of the town's odd pranks. An old woman walking her dog glanced once, then kept going as if it was nothing out of the ordinary. In Raven Springs, Georgia, people had gotten used to this tradition, or maybe they were just forced to. Brent Halvorson, 38, stepped back, his expression smug like a man who'd just won a contest no one else entered. He raised his arms, smirking like he was hosting a game show. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brent bellowed, "today we've got ourselves a special outsider. Anyone want to guess where he's from? Chicago? Detroit? Or maybe another planet?" Behind him stood Troy Decker, 41, tall and broad, arms crossed over his chest. He added flatly, "But he thinks this is New York. Around here, we've got our own rules." Sparse laughter trickled out from a few men at Cafe Havenstone across the street. Some cell phones were raised, filming. No one stepped in. No one asked why. The man tied to the pole, his name was Reuben Miles, 54, didn't flinch. He remained silent, eyes scanning the distance, as if he was reading the crowd's expressions more than paying attention to the two men behind him. In his mind, pieces began falling into place. This town had a deeper problem than any report ever filed to the state. No one in the crowd knew that the man they were watching was the new police chief, freshly appointed, transferred in from out of state. A man who had led major internal affairs investigations, who had testified before Congress on police reform. All they saw was a black man, a stranger, older than the usual troublemakers, dressed plainly, wearing a faded cap, no badge, no name tag, no threat. And for Brent and Troy, that made him a target. Reuben had known the moment he stepped into Cafe Havenstone the day before. The way the men in the corner stared at him like a stone dropping in the chest. But he didn't speak, didn't react, didn't resist. He just observed, because he knew, sometimes to clean a rotten pond, you have to let the mud rise first. Raventon tradition. Brent shouted like he was leading a parade. Tie the outsider to the pole. Make sure they remember. We don't welcome folks who don't follow our rules. Rules? Reuben thought. No, not rules. This was humiliation, dressed up in laughter. Intimidation, applauded by collective silence. What Brent and Troy didn't know was that this time, their little tradition had been caught on 3 different cameras. A video was already on its way out, and in just a few hours, the whole country would know what kind of place Raven Springs really was. And they'd know who just got exposed before being zip-tied to a lamppost like some petty criminal. Reuben Miles had only planned to spend his first morning in Raventon Springs observing, just as he had done in every department across 30 years of service. He wore no uniform, no badge, just an old dark brown jacket, a faded baseball cap, looking like any weary traveler searching for breakfast in a strange town. Cafe Havenstone sat on the corner like it hadn't changed since 1963. Weathered wooden door, a hand-painted sign with the word "Open" hanging slightly crooked. Reuben stepped inside. The bell over the door gave a faint jingle. pulling every eye in the room toward him. But these weren't curious stares. They weren't welcoming either. They were guarded. He'd seen that look before, in South Texas, in a back office at an Arizona precinct, and in more than one closed-door hearing in D.C. It always smelled the same. Exclusion. He ordered a black coffee. The woman behind the counter, older, wearing a cream apron, didn't say a word, just nodded. But in the corner, Brent Halvorsen and Troy Decker had gone silent the moment Reuben walked in. They didn't care who he was, only that he wasn't from here. "Hey, old man," Brent called out. "You lost or something?" His tone sounded playful, but his eyes weren't smiling. Reuben didn't respond. He glanced at them, then turned away. He knew this game, the kind played by men with small power and oversized egos. The kind that starts with bait, just to see who's easy prey. Maybe he thinks he's in Savannah or Atlanta. Troy muttered low, cold. "Folks like that aren't welcome here." Reuben took a sip of his coffee, then answered calmly, "Just passing through. No trouble intended." But it was that calmness, that quiet refusal to flinch, that got under Brent's skin. Something didn't feel right. Men like this, they weren't just passing through. When Reuben stepped out of the cafe, he heard chairs scrape behind him. He didn't need to look back. He knew the two of them were watching. The morning wind was crisp, but his spine didn't shiver. Instead, a familiar feeling rose in him, the scent of a place rotting from within. He knew exactly what kind of town this was. Towns like Raven Springs were built on so-called tradition. But sometimes tradition was just a mask for warped power and quiet cowardice. And here, something had clearly gone off track. Reuben chose not to show up at the Raventon Springs Police Department that morning. Not yet. He needed to see the truth first, before walking into a room that was supposed to uphold it. Now, he'd seen enough. 2 badge wearers without honor. A cafe soaked in silence. And a town conditioned to look the other way. He inhaled deeply, still holding his paper coffee cup, eyes fixed on the road ahead, Tanglewood Trail. That would be his next stop, a quiet place, away from the stairs, where he could piece together what he now knew. Less than 24 hours later, those same 2 officers would tie him to a post in the middle of town, as if he were some street-side joke. What they didn't know was that they had just triggered the beginning of their own downfall. Reuben Miles stood outside Cafe Havenstone, coffee still warm in hand, as morning sunlight broke across the weathered wood awning overhead. He paused beneath the faded sign that read, "Havenstone since 1952. His eyes scanned the window, where Brent Halvorsen and Troy Decker now sat staring back. Faces half mocking, half measuring. He knew men like them. The kind who needed to assert dominance the moment someone unfamiliar entered their turf. Not because they had reason, but because their instincts told them to. The instinct of men too used to never being questioned. Reuben walked over and set his coffee cup down on the small iron table outside the cafe. His hand brushed lightly across the brim of his faded cap. No sign of irritation on his face. Not because he didn't notice, but because he'd survived worse than condescending stares. Brent stood up, lean, with sun-bleached blonde hair like scorched summer grass. He carried himself with the swagger of someone halfway between a cowboy and a small-town enforcer. "Planning to settle down here, old man?" Brent asked, holding a coffee cup in one hand. But his voice was cold, like an ice cube sliding down a steel sink. "Or are you just sightseeing in foreign territory?" Reuben offered a faint smile, the kind that left the other person unsure if it was a joke or a warning. "I figure everyone needs a place to land eventually. Some folks choose the sea, some choose the mountains. Me, I go where the coffee's cheap and bitter." As he spoke, his eyes flicked briefly toward the badge on Brent's chest. Troy Decker, nearly twice Brent's size, stepped up beside him, hands in his pockets, eyes blank, like a man who never needed more than a single sentence to exert pressure. "We've got certain unwritten rules around here, you know," Troy muttered. "Strangers don't just show up and sit in the sun like they're part of this community." Reuben shrugged. "Didn't break any rules. Didn't cause a scene. Paid for my coffee fair and square." He took a small sip, then added, "Unless there's a hidden law tourists ought to know about." Brent nodded, smirk widening. "Exactly. Around here, Strangers don't get special treatment, and it's best not to act like you know the place. He stepped closer, close enough for Reuben to smell the trace of mint from the cigarette he'd just smoked. Because if you really understood, you wouldn't be sitting here in the first place. At that moment, anyone watching might think Reuben was the one outmatched. Older, outnumbered, two younger men, larger, entrenched in this town. But it was the way Reuben stayed silent, the way his eyes didn't back down, that made Brent and Troy pause. Reuben stood slowly, gave a polite nod. Thanks for the warm welcome. Classic Raventon Springs style. Then he walked off, quiet, unhurried, leaving Brent staring after him, brow slightly furrowed. At a nearby table, Elaine Jasper, a retired schoolteacher, watched Reuben's silhouette fade into the sun. She leaned toward the friend beside her and whispered, "That man's no ordinary traveler. I can tell. And those two, they just picked the wrong one." The next morning, Reuben Miles knelt by the edge of a pine-shaded road, tightening his laces along the path leading into Tanglewood Trail. The southern breeze was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine resin and damp soil after an overnight rain. He had once run through military forests in Fort Benning, sun-baked hills outside El Paso, and frozen city blocks in Detroit. But Tanglewood had a different feeling. Quiet, tucked away, almost like something was watching. He jogged at a steady pace, breath controlled, each footfall brushing away dust from the past to clear space for what was coming. But before he could finish his first loop, he heard it, tires crunching over loose gravel. Then a sharp, mocking chirp of a patrol siren. A Ford Interceptor veered up beside him, braking hard. The window rolled down. Brent Halvorson leaned on the steering wheel, eyes narrowed. In the passenger seat sat Troy Decker, flipping through a notebook like he'd just stumbled on a golden opportunity. "Morning, runner," Brent said, dragging out the word runner like it was a charge. "Get lost again?" Reuben stopped, rested a hand on his knee, and exhaled calmly. "Just out for a jog. Heard the trails here were decent." Troy snorted. "These trails are for locals." Brent opened the door and stepped out, letting his badge catch the early sunlight. He walked toward Reuben, closing the distance to less than 3 feet. Running's not a crime, but wandering around without proper ID, that could be a sign. He rubbed his hands together slowly, eyes drifting to the pocket of Reuben's jacket. Reuben stood upright. "I don't believe there's a Georgia law requiring runners to carry permits." Brent smiled, tight, crooked. "Small town, small rules. We like to keep things tidy." Without another word, Troy exited the vehicle as well. Both men advanced, and then, without warning, they began patting Reuben down. "Touching me without consent is a violation of personal rights," Reuben said, his tone steady, but his eyes sharpened like glass under pressure. Brent kept smiling, but now it was more of a smirk. He pulled a small plastic card from Reuben's jacket pocket. An old gym membership. Nothing more. Still, Brent held it high like he'd uncovered a biological weapon. "What's this?" "Fake ID. Foreign credential." Reuben said nothing, just stared directly into his eyes. And right then, a shutter click, then another. A young woman stood about 30 feet away, phone raised, filming everything. Her name was Tasha Elridge, a media student, out that morning snapping photos for a project called Town Perspectives. Troy noticed her first. "Hey, stop recording." But Tasha didn't flinch. "I'm on public property. I have every right to document what looks like abuse of power." Brent scowled, shot a glance at Troy, and muttered under his breath, "Enough. Let's take this guy downtown. If they want footage, let him record the full show." Reuben didn't resist, as the two officers grabbed him by the arms and began dragging him down the path leading back toward Millstone Square. Tasha followed, camera still rolling. A coffee truck driver parked nearby watched the scene unfold and blurted. "Another outsider parade?" Again, no one answered. But this time, there were witnesses. There was video. There was evidence. And Reuben knew they had just dug a hole too deep to climb out of. When the patrol car pulled up in front of Millstone Square, a few locals crossing toward the bakery across the street turned to look. They weren't surprised. They weren't afraid. They were used to it. Brent Halvorsen and Troy Decker yanked Reuben Miles from the back seat, like he was a petty thief caught stealing gum at the supermarket. His hands were twisted behind him. The collar of his jacket was dusted with roadside grit. Morning sunlight hit him square in the face, harsh and bright. But Reuben kept his expression calm. He'd seen enough in life to know men who think they're kings always choose a stage to crown themselves. And Millstone Square, with its black iron lamppost at the center, the circle of brick around it, and wooden benches lining the perimeter, was their perfect stage. Brent played it up like he was staging some twisted street performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he shouted, "please welcome a fine gentleman from far, far away, bringing with him the arrogance of a big city and a clear disrespect for the laws of Raventon Springs." His voice sharpened, hand waving high like a county fair MC. Behind him, Troy pulled a zip tie from his pocket. Without hesitation, he bound Reuben's wrists to the lamppost. The plastic straps hissed as they tightened, harsher than the quiet laughter of a few passers-by. A young mother, pushing a stroller, hesitated for a moment, thought about stopping, then kept walking without a word. An old man sipped from a paper coffee cup on the nearby bench, nodding silently. And Tasha Elridge, media student, stood just a few feet away, filming, eyes locked, never blinking. "What did he do?" asked a middle-aged man who had just bought a sandwich. Brent grinned, stepped closer, and clapped the man on the shoulder. "Crime of arrogance, and failing to understand our local traditions." A few chuckles echoed, unclear who started them. Reuben stood still, wrists cinched, but he didn't resist. He didn't bow his head, didn't beg. His gaze swept the crowd. Some looked away, some looked down, some quietly pulled out their phones. "Tradition," he muttered, barely audible. "I've seen traditions like this before. Alabama, back in the 60s. Mississippi, 75. Same poles, same stairs. Only difference is, these days, people carry phones instead of stones." Brent heard him. Brows arched, he stepped closer. "Listen here, old man. This ain't the place for preaching." Reuben smiled, faint, unshaken. "Not preaching. Just waiting to see how far y'all are willing to go before you fall flat on your face." Just then, Malik Ray, a local plumber everyone knew, quietly pulled out his phone. He leaned toward Elaine Jasper, the retired schoolteacher, and whispered, "This time, I think I'm keeping this video." Elaine didn't reply, but something in her eyes shifted. She had spent years avoiding scenes like this. But not today. Today, she pulled out her phone and hit record. No one shouted. No one rushed to intervene. But this time, too many lenses were watching. And this time, the man tied to the post didn't fold. Reuben knew exactly what they were doing. They were following this same tired script. What they didn't know was, this time, the entire country would be watching. Just hours after Reuben Miles was tied to the lamppost in Millstone Square, a 47-second video recorded by Tasha Elridge began circulating through local Facebook groups. No music, no edits, just raw footage of a middle-aged man, hands bound with zip ties, standing still before a watching crowd, while two laughing officers played MCs for their small-town tradition. The first hashtag #LampPostMan. Within 12 hours, the clip had surpassed 80,000 shares. By the time it reached Twitter, now called Xnet, it had become the nation's top trending topic overnight. Questions flooded every platform. Who was the man in the video? Why was he tied up? What the hell are Raventon Springs cops doing out there? Once just a dot on the map, a fuel stop between larger towns, Raventon Springs suddenly became the name on every major news channel. Channel 14 News was the first to dispatch a crew. Reporter Sienna Cook, known for her segment Citizen's Lens, stood in front of the weathered wooden sign of Millstone Square, broadcasting live. "We're here in the heart of Raventon Springs, where a video has surfaced showing an unidentified man being tied to a lamppost by two local officers. The footage has sparked outrage online, especially given there's no evidence of crime." The report aired during prime time, and with it came a rising wave of national fury. Independent journalists soon arrived at Cafe Havenstone, asking staff and regulars the same question. Who is the man in the video? Anyone know his name? One voice whispered, I heard he just moved here. Another guessed, ex-convict? Undercover reporter, maybe? Meanwhile, 45 miles away at the East Georgia prosecutor's office, the district attorney opened an email from the Federal Inspector's Division. Attached was a link to the video titled #LampPostMan, with a blunt message. This requires immediate review. Investigate the legality of Reuben Springs PD's actions. Elsewhere in town, Reuben stayed quiet. He knew the wave was coming. And once it crested, truth wouldn't stay buried. Tasha Elridge, whose video had now surpassed 3 million views, spoke during a brief interview. I didn't know who he was, but his eyes, they weren't afraid. It was like he already knew this would happen. And that's what made people even more curious. If he wasn't scared, then who is he really? That very afternoon, with the crowd's gaze growing sharper and less forgiving, Brent Halvorson stepped forward and cut Reuben's ties. Not out of guilt, but because the looks around him had changed. Support was fading. A young mother whispered while filming. What's his name? A teenager held his phone close to Troy's face. What crime do you think he committed? Brent smirked. Come on, old man. That's enough. Consider it a free workout. Reuben didn't respond. He rose, brushed the dust off his shoulder, and stared straight ahead, steadfast, unshaken. Tasha approached, still filming. Do you need help? Reuben nodded gently. No, but this town does. Then he walked away, quiet, without drama. But everything was just beginning. That night, Reuben Miles didn't sleep. He sat in front of a worn laptop, in a small rental home at the end of Ashbury Lane, replaying the video from Millstone Square. He didn't need to watch the whole thing. The first few seconds told him everything he needed. He opened an encrypted mailbox, typed a simple subject line, Reuben Springs needs light. He attached the video and hit send, straight to the Georgia Office of Public Integrity. At exactly 6:07 a.m. the next morning, the phone rang, just as Reuben Miles was brewing coffee in the small rental house at the end of Ashbury Lane. On the other end was the Georgia Office of Public Integrity. There was no greeting, just a command. Mr. Miles, we've seen the clip. The secretary wants this handled. Today. Reuben answered with a single word. Understood. He hung up the phone, opened his suitcase, and pulled out a navy blue dress shirt, perfectly pressed. Stitched crease, uniform trousers. Black leather shoes polished to mirror shine under the window light. He clipped the chief's badge to his chest. Every move deliberate. Not one wasted gesture. Reuben Springs PD, 8 a.m. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until the front door swung open and Reuben Miles stepped inside, in full uniform, each stride hitting the tile with quiet authority, like the floor itself moved in time with his boots. Inside, Brent Halvorson and Troy Decker were standing by the coffee machine, still laughing about yesterday's performance. A young officer was about to speak, but the room fell completely silent the moment Reuben entered, all eyes locked on his chest, on the gleaming gold shield with bold engraved lettering. Chief Reuben Miles, Reuben Springs Police Department. Brent turned. Whatever arrogance he wore drained out his face in under 3 seconds. Good morning, Reuben said, his voice low but clear. I hear this town has a special tradition for newcomers. Troy froze like a statue. Brent swallowed hard. Not a single person in the department, not a shift supervisor, not a desk clerk, had known that the man they tied to a pole yesterday was their chief of police. Before Brent could stammer out a word, the door behind them opened again. An older man, early 70s, wore a brown leather jacket and leaned on a cane. The eyes were unmistakable. Orville Creeley, former police chief of Reuben Springs. Reuben, he growled, didn't think you'd actually take the job. Reuben turned, nodded. Thanks for recommending me to the town, Creeley. Though I doubt you knew what kind of traditions your old protégés were keeping alive. Creeley scanned the room. His eyes landed on Brent and Troy, and darkened. I trained them, but I never taught tying a man to a lamppost in the middle of town. That was their choice. Reuben said nothing. He stepped into the center of the room, pulled out his phone, and tapped play. The original video, Tasha's footage, began to echo through the room. "This is what happened yesterday," he said, voice rising just enough for everyone to hear. "Not to some stranger, not to a trespasser, but to me, Reuben Miles, your chief of police." Brent opened his mouth, but Reuben raised a hand. "Don't. I didn't come here for excuses. I came to change the way this game is played." He turned to Troy. "And you? Still think that was just some friendly tradition?" Troy didn't speak. He lowered his head. For the first time since Reuben set foot in town, the room felt like stone, heavy, motionless. And in that moment, Raventon Springs finally understood one thing. This time, the man they tried to humiliate was the very one now steering the moral compass of their entire department. Reuben Miles stood in the center of the Raventon Springs PD briefing room, a dark paneled chamber with an old command board hanging crooked on the wall, and a wall clock that ran almost a minute slow. He scanned the room, eyes locking with each face. Veteran officers, front desk staff, rookie patrolmen not even a year into the job. Every single one was present. No one spoke. No one dare move. At the front, a projector hummed, casting the video from Reuben's phone onto the wall. The footage Tasha had captured of him tied to the lamppost filled the screen, big enough that no one could pretend not to see. The clip rolled. Brent Halvorson, laughing with a cigarette hanging from his mouth, tying Reuben's wrist to the lamppost in Millstone Square. Troy Decker, arms flailing theatrically, shouting to the crowd. "Here in this town, we don't house sneaky strangers." A few murmurs rippled through the room. Some young officers exchanged glances. Others looked down. Reuben let the video play through to the end, then turned off the projector. He didn't need to explain it. The shame, the shock, and the realization were already thick in the air. He nodded once, then spoke. His voice was low, deliberate. "So, does anyone here recognize the man in the video?" Silence. 1 second. 2. By the third, Reuben turned directly to Brent and Troy, now pressed so tightly against the wall. "You'd think they were hoping it would swallow them." "What about you two?" he asked. "Officers Halvorson and Decker. Do you recognize the man in that footage?" Brent clenched his jaw. Troy stood frozen, face flushed crimson. Neither said a word. Reuben took a step closer. His voice dropped, hard as steel. "Not recognizing me is one thing, but you didn't even check. No ID request. No questions. No report filed. Just mockery and public shaming. In the town square. Based on what? Tradition." He paused. "Do you know who I am now?" Brent opened his mouth to speak, but Reuben held up a hand. "No need. I'll let the video answer that for you." Then he turned to the rest of the room. "My name is Reuben Miles. I'm the newly appointed chief of police, installed by direct recommendation of the State Office of Public Integrity. What happened yesterday? That wasn't an accident. That was a choice." He looked at them, one by one. "Who here has known about this so-called tradition? Who's seen it happen before?" And said nothing. No hands went up, but Reuben didn't need them to. The eyes said everything. "The party's over," he said, voice cutting through the silence. "Starting today, the old culture has no place in this department." Brent shot up from his chair, trying to sound in control. "We're just doing what we've always done, keeping things the way they've always been." Reuben stepped forward, face to face with him. "Tradition isn't a shield to justify abuse. It's a blade, and if you wield it wrong, it cuts the one holding it." Brent said nothing. The room was breathless. For the first time, Raventon Springs PD understood. The game had a new referee. Reuben Miles didn't turn back. When Brent Halvorson began to mumble some half-formed excuse, he'd heard too many of those in his life, from bullies with badges to spineless politicians. Instead, he walked calmly to the front table, opened a black leather folder, and pulled out 2 thick envelopes, each stamped with the official letterhead of the Raventon Springs Police Department. The room was so silent, you could hear the crisp rustle of paper. Reuben placed the 2 envelopes on the table. "These are termination notices, effective immediately." His voice wasn't loud, but echoed through the room like a drumbeat. "Brent Halvorson, Troy Decker, step forward to surrender your badges, weapons, and internal system access cards." No one in the room laughed. No one clapped. But the air felt noticeably lighter. Brent glared at him. You don't have the authority to do this without an internal investigation. Reuben looked up, his gaze razor sharp. I am the internal investigation. And every piece of evidence was broadcast, not just to this room, but to the entire country. He waited. 1 second. 2. Troy hesitated, then slowly removed his badge and set it on the table. Brent stood still, clutching his access card like he meant to crush it in his palm. But finally, he exhaled, stepped forward, and laid everything down on the cold wooden surface, leaving behind a final look filled with resentment and defeat. Reuben watched them leave the room. They never looked back. When the door shut behind Brent and Troy, he turned to face the rest of the team. Listen closely, he said. I didn't come here to purge anyone. I came to fix the way we do this job. He paused, looked at each face, especially the younger ones. Those who've been on the force less than 3 years. Police officers are not here to humiliate people just because they're new or different or don't look like us. We are not street performers looking for a crowd to entertain. We are the first to arrive at the scene, the ones who listen, the ones who stop the bleeding. And if anyone here isn't willing to live up to that title, the door is still open. A young female officer sitting in the front row quietly nodded. An older man, likely a veteran, let out a deep breath, as if finally setting down a weight he'd carried in silence for years. Reuben closed with this. Starting today, in Raven Springs, no tradition stands above the dignity of a human being. No exceptions, no what-ifs, just right and wrong. And we will stand on the side of right, or we will not stand in this force at all. Silence spread through the room, but not from fear, from awareness. A new chapter was beginning, not written in blood, not in bullets, but in real people, with real action. The news of Brent Halvorson and Troy Decker's dismissal spread like lightning across Raven Springs. On a cloudy morning that felt like a storm was coming, crowds gathered outside the police station, the same building that had been a stage for cruelty just a week ago. Now the epicenter of something different, a community waking up. There were no organizers, no pre-printed signs, but one by one, Elaine Jasper, the retired teacher, Malik Ray, the town plumber. They showed up with handwritten placards, trembling voices, and eyes filled with memories buried far too long. Brent threatened to arrest me 5 years ago for standing on the wrong sidewalk. Troy tore through my car one summer afternoon. No reason, no warrant. They called my son a troublemaker just because he wore a black hoodie after 7 p.m. Within 72 hours of Reuben signing the termination orders, the East Georgia Prosecutor's Office officially launched a criminal investigation into Brent and Troy. Files once buried, reports missing signatures, cameras that had technical issues, all of it now surfaced as damning proof of a rotten system. Channel 14 News aired a special segment titled, #LampPostMan. When one man stands, the whole town hears. And that's exactly what happened. When Reuben Miles chose not to retaliate with rage, but with calm, integrity, and decisive action, he didn't just expose 2 officers. He exposed a habit, a silence, a culture of fear disguised as tradition. Under Reuben's leadership, Raven Springs PD began a reform initiative the town had never seen before. Every new officer would now undergo a 90-day community ethics training program. An independent oversight board was created, made up of local citizens, faith leaders, and college students from nearby counties. Quarterly open forums were hosted at Millstone Square, once a stage for humiliation, now a space for public dialogue. By fall, the old Justice Now protest posters have been replaced with community boards bearing bold new words. Police are not enforcers. Police are servants. At the newly introduced Honor Star ceremony, a tradition Reuben personally established, he addressed the full department. We can't rewrite the past, but we can choose not to live in it every day. Every action we take, every glance, every handshake, is a choice between repeating the old or stepping bravely into the new. Standing at the back, a young officer named Jonah Fields raised a salute, his eyes glassy. He had been one of the first to submit a resignation, until the day he saw Reuben, bound to a lamppost and refusing to break. That moment of a man humiliated in the public square became a living lesson for an entire generation. A reminder that silence is not neutral, that justice doesn't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it comes in the form of one person standing still at the right time, acting in the right place. In Raven Springs, it was no longer some forgotten pit stop on the map. It had become a symbol of transformation, sparked by one man and carried by many. The story of Reuben Miles wasn't just about a man being publicly humiliated. It was a profound reminder that justice doesn't begin with a siren or a pair of handcuffs. It begins with a person who stops, sees injustice, and chooses to confront it. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the calm in the middle of a storm, the eyes that don't lower when mocked, the man who chooses action over revenge. Reuben didn't shout. He didn't hit back. He didn't run. He let the truth do its job. And because of that, a town woke up. We live in a world where broken traditions still hide, in our silences, in the way we look and pretend not to see. But that can change. It only takes one person brave enough to stand. It could be you. It could be me. And sometimes, change begins with just one story told at the right time. If this story made you think, if you saw yourself in Reuben's eyes, or in the silence of Raventon Springs, leave a comment below. Mr. 7 Stories is listening, not just to tell stories, but to connect people who still believe in justice, dignity, and real change. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you want to keep following true stories. Stories that dare to dig into what's right, what's wrong, and what's worth fighting for. Thank you for watching to the end. And remember, sometimes a single steady gaze in a storm is enough to make an entire system tremble.